In this lesson, we're going to make the final quality adjustments for our interior render. Okay, so based on where we left off in our previous lesson, I've gone ahead and continued with the material application, so I finished up the rest of this room. So if you'd like to open up the lesson file for this particular video, you can open this right up and follow along from this point. So looking at our render, you can see that we're pretty much done with the hard part as far as the lighting and materials. Really, the only thing that's left is to just enable a few extra quality settings, and we're pretty much done. So looking at this, you can start to see where we maybe run into a few issues. For example, we have areas like this pillow that are over on this couch. If you look, you'll notice that there's really not very good contact shadows here. It just sort of look like this pillow is floating. Also, where we have these cushions that sort of meet, again, not very good contact shadows that we have in these areas. Another area where this starts to become really apparent is over on this television, where we have these little panels that meet up along the wall. Again, just not very good contact and grounding shadows in these areas. Now, we can fix this pretty easily by just turning on and increasing our final gather sampling. The problem is, though, that these features are really going to start to slow down our renders. So that's why I've intentionally waited until I'm almost done with my image to start really bumping up these quality settings. So if we take a look inside the render setup, if we jump over into the indirect illumination tab, we can start by bumping up our final gather settings. Now, if you take a look down toward the bottom of your render settings, we do have our final gather precision, and we can start to dial this up and use some of the presets that are available in Max. Now, as a matter of personal preference, I really don't like to use these presets. I start to find that by going in here and customizing some of your settings, you can get actually a better mix of quality and speed than what you're going to get with some of these presets. So for example, our default mode is set to draft for our final gather precision. So if we go back into our render setup, you can see we have final gather point density of about 0.1, 50 final gather rays, interpolated over 30 points. Now, again, that's very basic settings. Now, if we start to go up to something like a medium, you can start to see where our quality settings start to change automatically for us. So, again, rather than rely on this precision, I'm going to come in here and actually make my own settings. So I find that a final gather point density of something like 1 tends to work really well. That'll make sure that we have enough of these final gather points to start to capture a lot of these really fine, nice little details. Also, for the number of final gather rays, I like to usually set this to something like 100. I usually find that that gives us a pretty good mix of having enough of these final gather rays shooting out to get some really good information returned, but not so much that we're just wasting a lot of unnecessary render time. I will go ahead and turn off this final gather point interpolation down here toward the bottom, and I'll set the number of final gather rays to interpolate to something like 10. So 1, 100, and 10. For your final quality output, you may want to bump these values up a little bit more, but for a great mix of quality and speed, I find this to be a great batch of settings to use. So let's come in, and I'm going to draw out a region, just so we maybe have something to compare to. So let me move my region maybe over to a portion of this television and re-render. Okay, now once that's finished, if we were to come in, I'll turn off my region tool and get in here just a little bit closer now. If you look, now you can definitely see a difference. So whereas before, if I were to move this down so maybe we can see a little bit more of this render, before, again, you could see where we weren't really getting these very good contact shadows. These wall panels just sort of looked like they were a little bit more floating up against the wall. Where now, if you sort of focus your attention into this area where my mouse is, you can see definitely we have much better contact shadows in these areas. So that's the sort of things that increasing my final gather sampling and final gather quality settings is really designed to, again, just sort of give me better results. Now, over here along the television, it still really doesn't look all that great. Definitely some very minimal improvements that have been made here. So rather than coming in and continuing to increase these final gather settings, Sometimes I like to rely on the ambient occlusion settings that are built right into the materials themselves. And that's another reason that I really like to use these architectural materials that I've been using, because they actually have built-in ambient occlusion. So if I tap the M key on my keyboard, and in my material editor, let's just go to Get All Scene Materials. There we are. And now I can just simply go down my material list here. And with these architectural materials, if you take a look inside the special effects rollout, we have ambient occlusion. Now, as far as the overall distance that you want your ambient occlusion to reach, that's really entirely up to you. The look of your scene scale, that really is going to determine what you want to use. In my case, I'm going to use about 15 centimeters. And that should be just enough to where this ambient occlusion can start to reach into some of these shadowed areas and just provide me a little bit of extra contact shadow. I don't want to get too crazy with my ambient occlusion, because if we start to get a little bit too overboard with this, that really tends to hurt your scene more than help it. We've probably seen renders where the ambient occlusion is maybe used a little bit too extensively, and it's very, very obvious that it's a CG render. So we want to really try to focus on subtlety. So I'm going to go in and just turn on my ambient occlusion. I already have all of these set to about 15 centimeters for my sample distance, or my max distance. So just go through here. And I'll pause this for just a moment while I finish making my adjustments. Okay, so now I have ambient occlusion that has been turned on all of my materials. So now if I go back to my rendered frame window, go back to my region, and I'll pull this region down a little bit further. There we are, just so we have something to compare to. And now, let me just re-render this little piece. Alright, and now if we get in here a little bit tighter, just move that over so we can see that. Now you can really start to see where this ambient occlusion starts to help out. So whereas before, where we had just the final gather settings up here, kind of in this area, again, you can see it does help a little bit, but compare that to what we've now done with the ambient occlusion added on. You can see it does a much, much nicer job of just grounding this element sort of in these shadowed areas. You can see even in this area of the television, it's done a much, much better job of sort of anchoring that against the wall as far as the shadows are concerned. Now, even if you look in these areas where we have these little pieces of the cabinet here that sort of connect together, where we have the top, the base, and sort of these little drawers here, you can see even with the ambient occlusion, we've added just a little bit of extra shadowing and a little bit of extra detail into these areas. And that's detail that was just not quite there before. So if you use this ambient occlusion in a subtle way, it can make a tremendous impact as far as your render is concerned with the realism and things like that. So to compare that, now if I were to go back and re-render this little piece of the couch with these new settings enabled, I'll come in and try to render this in a way to where we can still sort of see what we had before. So let me re-render this little piece. There we are, and you can see, again, just much, much better grounding of these elements. So this area of the pillow doesn't look like it's really floating anymore. These contact shadows have now really grounded this onto the surface of the pillow. And you can see this area where we have now the occlusion as well as increased final gather quality. It's done now a much, much better job of adding some of these little shadows in these little separation pieces between the cushions, where before that almost completely disappeared. And we should start to see these sorts of quality improvements all over our entire scene. And again, while it is really, really tempting to try to turn these features on and start to get some very pretty renders early on, the sacrifice you're going to start to make in your render times is just not really worth it. So just remember, you can always come back and fix these little floating and grounding issues at a later point. But for the sake of speed, it's really going to be best for you to leave those settings off until pretty much the last minute or the last step in your lighting process. Now, at this point, we're pretty much ready to output our final image. So if we were to go back into our render setup, let's go back into our render setup over here. There we are. And let's go into our Common tab. If we scroll down, we can now output our image. So let's save the file. Let's click on the Files button. And this is going to output this really wherever we want. I'm going to save this out as an HDR format. So hit save. Again, if you recall from one of our earlier lessons, this starts to relate back to what we had set up in our gamma and LUT setup. So for our output gamma, again, with this set to 1, that's going to be useful if you're going to output some kind of an HDR or an EXR format render. If you wanted to output a JPEG or a bitmap, Targa, something like that, then you would probably want to set your output to 2.2. But again, in my case, with this being the type of format that I want to output, we'll leave this set to 1. So now, if we go back to my render frame, make sure that this is set to render out the entire view. At this point, now I can render out. Now, one last thing I may want to do before we actually output this is, if you'll notice, we do have some noise and some artifacts that are happening a little bit higher up here. Now, this is probably related to my shadows and shadow artifacts. So what you may want to do is, if you do run into this type of a situation, you can always come in and start to increase your soft shadows precision. So as you start to dial this up a little bit higher, again, this is going to start to really slow down our renders, but in our case, that's something that we will probably definitely need to do. And once we have all of these different quality settings set appropriately, just simply render. Okay, now once that image or that render is complete, then here's our final image. So if we were to double click on that and open that up in some kind of an image editing application, we could open this up in Photoshop if we wanted to. Although if you open it up in certain applications, you may notice that the image itself looks very, very dark. And that's completely normal. That just has to do with the fact that this was rendered out as an HDR format image. So if you have the ability to do gamma adjustments and things like that, if you were to bring your gamma back up to something like 2.2, now it looks exactly as it should. And this is, again, is a completely normal workflow for using a high dynamic range image. And the beauty of having a high dynamic range image is now we have a lot more freedom and control over things like the exposure, the darkness values, and things like that. So it just gives us a much, much greater level of control in our post application. Alright, so that's now going to bring us to the conclusion of this interior rendering course for 3ds Max. Now, one thing that I would invite you to do is to post some of your work in our forums as you're starting to go through this and start to work through some of your own interiors. I'd really love to see how you can take some of these topics, these tools, and some of these concepts that we've explored in this course, and really see how you can start to build upon these and make them your own for some of your own interior renders. And as always, be sure to check out the additional 3ds Max training that we have available at Digital Tutors.